Let's get started, I guess.
Yeah, please go
Um,
ahead.
yeah, well, I wanted to thank you, Marco, of course, and APRI for inviting me first. I've been, following you guys for a while, and wanting to present at one of your journal clubs as well for a while. It hasn't happened since I took so long to finish my master's, but here we are. And yeah, thank everybody for coming as well. Um, it's nice to see there's some interest, at least, or at least support from friends and family. So today the presentation is on my second chapter, as Marco said. This is specifically about psychedelic therapy and psychedelic therapy for depression through the lens of phenomenology and phenomenological psychiatry. And I propose that it basically functions by transforming our lived reality, right? So before we kind of get into the whole shenanigans, I thought I'd kind of introduce why I think phenomenology is important in the context of psychedelics. Okay, so when I talk about phenomenology, I'm talking specifically about the philosophical tradition that goes by this name, which is often associated with French existentialism of the middle of the 20th century, and we can say that this is a philosophical mode of thinking that begins from a description of experience and specifically its structures, rather than simply making inventory of subjective effects, right? Which is what often goes by the name of phenomenology and psychedelic studies, where you give people questionnaires and you make lists of what they felt or what they say they felt. So it is precisely like I want to precisely move beyond this view of experience as purely subjective in this presentation and through a phenomenological lens of psychedelic therapy. So broadly, I would say that phenomenology is useful because it gives a conception of experience which transcends what I call individualism, which stands for a set of premises that, in my opinion, are ill-suited to understand not only the nature of experience in general, but also psychedelic experiences, the therapeutic mechanisms by which they work, and some of the mental health conditions for which psychedelic therapy is useful. So what is individualism that I write with this like funky slashed writing? Basically, what I try to signal with this slash is that it's a combination of individualism and dualism, right? And together they inform the idea that experience, including that of a psychedelic kind, occurs strictly within the individual's head, and that this is an inner space as opposed to the external world, which remains untouched by these experiences. So these premises you can mostly are found and promoted by psychological, sometimes spiritual, and neuroscientific understandings of psychedelic experiences, which dominate the field and which tend to reduce these experiences to a mind or a brain on drugs. So since psychedelic experiences from their perspective are internal and never bear on reality as such, they can only ever be understood as hallucinations or escapes from reality, even if they are somehow therapeutically useful, right? So you have predictive processing or this idea that all experience is an online hallucination are like examples of this. So this implies, of course, the further assumption that reality is simply one fixed way, that it is what it is, and that an altered perception or an alternative perspective of it must therefore amount to a misperception, right? Reality remains the same underneath its psychedelic distortion, and it cannot be changed by it. So in this sense, only the self can be changed. We can only change ourselves, but not reality. And this is kind of the thing that I want to challenge through the lens of phenomenology. So the problem with these accounts is that they actually betray the constantly repeated insight that psychedelics produce experiences of connectedness and that the set and setting or context of use heavily influences them, right? You cannot be locked inside your head and at the same time be connected or influenced by your context. And the same goes with openness, right? There's these studies about how psychedelics increase openness, and then they make openness into a character trait, right? Something that kind of defines you, but actually openness must be openness to something, right? It means that you're in an open relationship to something that's outside of you. So even while this research acknowledges that a focus on context and experience would be a positive paradigm shift in psychiatry, they can only make sense of connection as either a mechanistic or a subjective thing, right? So either as kind of just a cause and effect thing of the chemicals inside your brain, or as a subjective, purely personal and private experience. So they can't think of connectedness as real, right? What you have in the end is connectedness without connection, or that you're connected, but you're actually by yourself. But phenomenology, on the other hand, is able to take these themes seriously because it considers experiences worldly rather than private, and crucially, embodied rather than mental, right? So it's not something that happens inside of our heads, but it happens out there in the world towards which we reach, with which we make contact, and in which we're embedded through our bodies. And perhaps some of you are familiar with 5E cognition, which is a strand of think about like connecting cognitive science to phenomenology. And the 5Es stand for enactive, embodied, extended, ecological, and embedded, right? So this kind of captures what the general idea is about. So this actually shows that a certain connectedness is in fact integral of experience, right? As patients say, psychedelic connection is more normal than the disconnection of depression, to which we will get in a minute. Importantly, this also implies that since we can touch and affect reality, it is not fixed but actually transformable, which is something that has certain political implications that I'm interested in, and which I'll return to at the end of the presentation if we have time. So now that I've explained phenomenology briefly, let me say like what I think phenomenology allows us to do is to answer several important questions about psychedelic therapy, right? And these are what is the mechanism of psychedelic therapy, right? And we need to answer this question in a way that makes connection and setting count. How can psychedelics be said to concern reality and not only the self? Why do they transform reality and not merely amplify it, right? Since psychedelics kind of sensitize you to your set and setting, a lot of people go to this idea that they're merely kind of non-specific amplifiers of experience. So they don't do anything specific, they just amplify what's already there, right? But instead, I want to think of why they transform and not only amplify reality, as patients and other people who consume psychedelics report. And finally, why do the therapeutic effects last beyond their direct psychoactive action, right? This is hard to think about it from the perspective that I've been kind of criticizing of individualism. Here's a quote from the previous studies. Our finding of increased global functional connectivity in the psychedelic brain, right? This is the mechanistic aspect of connectedness, and its relationship to ego dissolution may be considered a candidate neural correlate of the unitive experience, right? So that's the subjective element of the mystical oneness experience. And how this relates to longer term feelings of connectedness, however, is perhaps a more challenging question, which is one of the ones that I want to be answering. So with these questions in mind, I think we can begin by asking whether depression is really a mental health condition at all, or whether it's better to think of it in terms of our embodied relation to the world. But before that, I just want to outline really quickly what the presentation is going to be like. So I'm going to talk about depression first as actually paralleling it's kind of a lived experience of individualism. So it actually really fits the assumptions of individualism as kind of a pathology. So it kind of makes us rethink whether individualism is a correct way of not only understanding depression, but our usual way of being in the world. Then we'll move on to phenomenology in the sense of reality. This will be, working from what depression tells us is kind of an abnormal form of experience. We can kind of deduce a certain idea of what experience is normally like. And then finally, I'll go into psychedelic therapy as immersive reflection and how that functions, which is the last and longest part. And I hope you can hang in with me to that point because it gets a bit heavy. But basically, I wanted to say that I'll be working with this based on this article by the Imperial College London on psilocybin therapy for depression, right? Which tracks this shift in patients from disconnection to connection, and also of avoidance to acceptance. And we'll see that at the end. Okay, so depression. What is depression? Depression is fundamentally a generalized condition of disconnection, which is evocative of the individualist world as imagined by Descartes, who you might know is a 17th century philosopher, and we could say is kind of the father of modern dualisms. So he's most famous for defending a strict mind-body dualism, and in doing so, he actually also separated thinking from feeling, self from others, and more generally, self from world or nature. And all of these separations actually are found in patients' descriptions of depression, right? So they complain of feeling trapped in their minds and detached from their bodily senses, right? It feels like being in a mental prison, locked in a cage, or enclosed in a very narrow space. They they also complain of being able to think or intellectualize things, but being incapable of feeling them, right? So I would look at the orchids and intellectually understand that there was beauty, but not experience it. They also talk of feeling isolated from others, right? I felt isolated, I felt alone. And they also complain of being unable to engage in the world, right? I couldn't leave my bed for a year. Their kind of field of action and of life just becomes extremely, extremely constricted. So, what this tells us is that far from being the normal state of things, this kind of Cartesian dream of a closed individual self located in the mind is precisely descriptive of depression. Right? These are people who are trapped in their self because their body becomes closed. Nonetheless, dominant approaches to depression, such as the medical model, still view it as an inner mental or individual disorder, right? And these are inherently dualist approaches which view the patient as separated from its context, and depression as a result of either distorted thinking, wrong and negative beliefs, harmful behaviors, chemical imbalances, and so on. Which is to say that they consider depression to be something wrong with or inside the patient. But the problem, as described by patients themselves, is that what is missing is a certain connection to something other than themselves, and that it is this individuality which is the problem to begin with. So instead, I'll be taking patient experiences seriously, and to do so, I will use Thomas Fuchs' concept, which he's a phenomenological psychiatrist. And his concept is corporealization, realization, and this will help me to think about depression as a form of bodily detunement, which is expressive of inhabiting a disconnected world rather than of a deep rooted individual disorder. And I think this phrase of his really captures neatly the kind of shift in thinking we have to make, and which is the illness is not in the patient, but the patient is in the illness, right? So how do we explain depression not as something that is inside of people's head or something wrong with them, but something that they are actually in, something related to the reality in which they live their lives. So, what is corporealization? Corporealization is the process of reification of the body, right? Of its turning into a sort of object, which turns into a heavy, solid body, which puts up resistance to all intentions and impulses directed towards the world. It is this inability of the body to open and extend into the world which produces a progressive bodily sense of constriction, which many patients compare to being locked in a prison. And in turn, this will also help us understand why psychedelic experiences feels liberating, right? With this prison to freedom metaphor. So to think of depression as a bodily and worldly phenomenon, we can start with a phenomenological account of moods first discussed by Heidegger, for whom moods are not an internal state of individuals, but the emergent result of the interaction between self and world. So moods are not in us, but as the expression has it, it is us who are in the moods. Moods, we can also describe moods as vague atmospheres that permeate and tinge the whole field of experience, which is why we often describe them through words relating to weather. In a bright mood, in a warm mood, or cold. And these words reflect the overall tonality of an emotional space in which we find ourselves. This space is composed of situations, persons, objects, which have expressive qualities, and we dwell in it through the embodied responses such as bodily tension, changes in heartbeat or breathing, or tendencies to approach or withdraw from the situation. Whether we are aware of it or not, all our moods are experienced through such bodily feelings. So bodily feelings are expressive of a situation rather than of an inner self, right? They kind of go outside in instead of inside out, as we kind of tend to think about things. When this bodily resonance with our situation is missing, we simply do not feel the connection between self and world that brings us health, so to speak. So one last thing about moods is that because they're kind of overarching atmospheres that structure how we're directed towards the world and how we can be affected by things, they also define what possibilities of a situation we can respond to and how. So for example, finding yourself in a good or a bad mood might determine whether you perceive somebody's sarcastic comment as inviting and humorous or as hostile. So, as a form of bodily detunement and disturbance of affectivity, depression severely limits our capacity to respond to and be affected by the possibility of getting out of it, which is why it's easy to get stuck in it and enter a sort of vicious circle where you can't connect, so you withdraw, and because you withdraw, you can't connect, and on and on and on. So, importantly, importantly, most patients actually contextualize their depression as a social inability to reach others, which renders depression also a failure of intercorporeality, which is the term that Fuchs uses to describe how in social interaction, we do not stand apart from each other, but in fact, the other's body extends onto my own and my own extends onto the other. Drawing particular attention to the attunement between infant and caregiver, where we see the development of intercorporeality in its earliest stages, Fuchs describes the acquired ability to establish reciprocity through gestures, facial expressions, and other micro practices through which we form an intercorporeal dialogue. It is through this bodily resonance, right, this offering and responding to subtle bodily cues, that mutual incorporation takes place, locking us into a shared vibe or wavelength through which we flow into one another, right? So this vibe or wavelength thing, which is, sounds very spiritual and hippie and non-material, is actually kind of a real phenomena that happens in very subtle bodily interaction. It's important as well that, when you actually access somebody in this way, you extend yourself to them. You don't only kind of incorporate their immediate body, but you're open onto the world as seen by them, right? Which opens you onto the possibilities that the world offers from their perspective. And this is very important because connecting with others is crucial to get out of depression. Since if we can't access a different perspective on ourselves, patients start to, feel completely equated with their depressed state. So they become depressed objects, self-contained depressed individuals, incapable of change. And so the condition, seems inevitable and recovery is indefinitely deferred. Of course, I don't know if you've ever talked to somebody who felt depressed or so on. They can, literally talk to, or relate to others, but it is because there's this detunement from them that they complain of being unable to reach them or be affected by them, right? And in extreme cases, depression could evolve into something called Cotard Syndrome, whose defining feature is actually that relatives have been replaced by imposters or machines, right? So your experience of other people is not of them as people, but as some sort of robot or not a real person. So in this sense, as drugs that, once you ingest them, pretty much force you to experience the world differently, psychedelics are perhaps best viewed as others through whom we access a new perspective on our reality and reestablish our contact with the world, right? And this might be the kind of phenomenological truth behind indigenous cultures that think of ayahuasca or other psychoactive plants as beings that are trying to tell you something, or that have knowledge that they want to transmit, and so on. So just like other people, psychedelics can breathe new life into our reality when it starts to appear dead. So we've considered so far how depression affects yourself through this kind of closing of your body, and your relations with others through this failure of intercorporeality. But we can also look at what it does to your perception of the world and reality itself. And what we find there is that, far from capturing our usual sense of reality, the notion of a fixed and separate world existing at a distance is in fact a form of derealization. Oops, here we go. In extreme cases as well, depression can also converge with Cotard Syndrome, which this syndrome is constituted by a feeling that one's own body and the world are somehow dead. And this is a world that actually strongly echoes Descartes' understanding of the body as an object separate from the mind, and of an external world of purely mechanical and objective spatial relations. So the inability to reach the exterior world makes everything, including oneself, appear essentially disconnected, right? Making patients feel like an isolated object in a world without relationships. There is only abstract space that only shows the naked framework of objects, not their connectedness or their flesh, as Fuchs writes. This detached perspective, which perceives the world as neutrally laid out in front of us, offers us nothing but a truly dreadful and incapacitating repetition and sameness, right? Nothing stands out and nothing makes a difference to us. Thankfully, as Matthew Radcliffe, another phenomenological psychiatrist, writes, the mechanistic world is not actually lived in. Presenting a complete solid reality as simply there and without the possibility of it being any different, to be depressed is fundamentally to exist in a world bereft of possibilities, lacking any sense of possibilities. And in the absence of these possibilities, there can be no agency, no capacity for you to act, because acting is actually actualizing possibilities that exist in the world. There is no future, since there's no time in which reality differs from the present. It simply is the way it is now. And therefore, an all pervading hopelessness sets in. So, getting out of depression implies reconnecting to new, previously inaccessible possibilities that exist in our surroundings. And psychedelics can help us do that by a process that I call immersive reflection. But before we get to that, let me quickly see like what we've learned about our usual healthy form of experience from its contrasts with depression. Okay. So first of all, at the broadest level, let's repeat that it appears that being connected to others and to the world is a fundamental aspect of all experience, right? So this implies a rather constant transcendence of pure self-enclosed individuality. It is not a special feature of mystical experience, transpersonal experience, or psychedelic experience. Even if in these experiences, this kind of transcendence is greater, it is only possible due to our basic openness to the world to begin with. And secondly, it's important that the medium of this connection with what is beyond ourselves is our body, which is not a closed object, but our means of extending ourselves towards the world and beyond the boundaries of our skin. What else have we learned? We've also learned that the world is not simply laid out neutrally in front of us, appearing as a bundle of independent objects that make no difference to us. Instead, as phenomenologists would say, we're directed towards the world according to a particular orientation, which makes part of it stand out and be salient in meaningful ways. So these orientations are like paths of action given to us by the tasks and projects in which we are already involved, and they produce this they organize the space around us, producing a set of distances and proximities, such that some things are close by, some are relegated into the background, and some never even come into view. So we can say that they establish a set of boundaries of perception and action through which our experience becomes organized. So as a simple example, you have an orientation as a writer, you will, pen, paper, and a desk will be kind of close to you in your proximity, while other tasks such as exercising, cooking, or child rearing might be relegated into the background and not appear you might almost not really even understand them because they're so far away from your experience, so to speak. So crucially, as this kind of points to another thing, this concept of orientation, which is that by delineating certain paths that we follow, orientations imply the temporality of experience, such that we have arrived at our orientations from the past and continue them into the future. So this means that an orientation is not a matter of a static perception of what's in front of you at a particular moment, but a dynamic one which includes a sense of possibility. Again, given an orientation as a writer, you might say, this will include a possibility of going to a literary conference or a book signing, whilst being oriented as a cook will not include those possibilities. So we do not perceive the world as given once and for all, simply as it currently is, but as including different possibilities. Phenomenologists call this indeterminate set of interconnected possibilities for further perception and actions the horizon of experience, right? This thing that you can kind of barely see, but is nonetheless kind of drives you forward. And we can also describe this horizon as referring to the fact that what is actually given in experience is not all that is given. We experience not only what is directly in front of us, but also the possibility of different later perceptions. So while here we go beyond a simple empiricism, which considers reality to be simply what exists, we also have to be careful to not turn this kind of extra dimension of what is not immediately present into a mental projection, right? To make sense of this, we can use Merleau-Ponty's concept of motivation. He's a French phenomenologist. And by this concept of motivation, he means that self and world are in a sort of dialogue where the world itself solicits, invites, and calls forth the unfolding of our perception, and we in turn take it up, answer, and respond to this call and actualize its offering. So self and world, from this point of view, are mutually constitutive, right? They don't exist prior to each other. And the possibilities we perceive the world to include are actually really there, even if they're not actualized, right? So if you think of a kitchen, for example, we do not perceive it as a sum of separate independent objects just laying there, but as a meaningful whole which offers the possibility of cooking. Certainly, we endow it with its being a kitchen, but it's nonetheless true that it invites us to cook in ways that a living room simply doesn't. And this possibility is what defines it as a kitchen and not as a living room. So we can also state that depending on our position in the world, right, which is also determined economically, socially, historically, and so on, the possibilities it offers are different, right? And because of this, we can also say that orientations shape our bodies differently, how they can feel and what they can do, since our bodies express these particular worlds into which we extend ourselves. So given different perspectives on reality, we can say that there is no one sense of reality as such, because reality includes different possibilities depending on from where and how you're invited to approach it. So with all this, we can come to a sort of definition of our sense of reality, which I also borrow from Matthew Radcliffe, which is that it is both a bodily feeling and a way of finding oneself in the world, which makes some things possible and not others. And it has two key elements here. The first one is that the self is not an internal thing, but a field phenomenon, which means that it is constituted by the world it is situated in and which it opens onto. And this world is something that acts as an extension of our bodies, right? So the world as you live it is an extension of yourself. And in fact, it is yourself. And the second key element is that reality is constituted as a possibility space, right? Against these kind of individualist accounts, which consider that the world simply exists out there and is fully, kind of fixed, solid block, there is actually an element of possibility to it, of things that don't yet quite exist, but nonetheless pertain to the world. So if we're capable of passing over this kind of emptiness of reality, right, as opposed to this kind of solidity of complete self-containment, it is because on the one hand, by repeating and our habit of repeating our particular orientations with little friction or disturbance, it seems full and simply as we perceive it to be. And on the other hand, it is also because our experience is actually shaped by ideologies that share such assumptions. So for example, thinking that reality simply is one particular way helps us ignore, dismiss, or disavow those breaks or slippages in our perception that suggest that it might be other than it appears, or also dismiss other people's perspectives. So as phenomenologists always insist, it is only when our sense of reality undergoes shifts that what was taken for granted becomes visible to us, just as depression just helped us see the nature of our usual mode of being in the world. Although more normal than depressive disconnection, psychedelic experiences are another form of large experiential shift, which helps us visualize our predicament as well as find alternatives to it, which is why they have therapeutic effects. Okay. Entering final stage, psychedelic therapy. This is the longest part, so bear with me. I hope it's useful and what you came for. So with the tools of phenomenological psychiatry, we can now understand connection as a real and normal thing that goes missing in depression, rather than some sort of neurological or non-ordinary experience. And we can also think about it more carefully and how it works therapeutically. And it does so through a process that I would call immersive reflection, which is made up of two simultaneous and interrelated movements. On the one hand, there is reflection. So something that we can virtually guarantee when you take psychedelics is that they will produce a large and swift shift in your experience, right? An altered state of consciousness. And this radically unsettles your taken for granted sense of reality. By breaking this kind of habitual repetition on which your sense of reality is based, we're able to access a new perspective through which we can reflect on what previously remained invisible about it. Hence, as so many people report, psychedelics allow you to see or discover something that's like very basic about yourself, or obvious things that were, already there and that you kind of knew but didn't know that were there. This strange dynamic. And this first movement is captured by themes of going outside yourself, of ecstasy, of crossing some threshold to another side, or the dissolution of boundaries that stabilize your reality and your sense of self. So in relation to your previous orientation, this aspect of psychedelics renders them a certain poison that produces a kind of ego death, as some people call it. On the other hand, you have immersion, which basically stands to mean that this reflection is not a function of becoming detached from reality, but on the contrary, of plunging into its other possibilities, right? Which kind of goes against this idea that was mostly popular in the 60s, but still is in the study of mystical experience, that through psychedelic experience, you kind of suspend your cultural self, right? Your cultural conditioning, and you just kind of float above the world in some sort of spirit realm. Actually, what's going on is that by responding to alternatives that actually exist in your environment, you're pulled out of your previous predicament and into something different. So in a certain sense, the way out of a particular reality is only ever more reality. This in turn is captured by themes of removing the filters of perception, or as Huxley called it, relaxing the reducing valve and opening the doors of perception. Indeed, reality is much richer than we normally notice. And admitting this is not a matter of, saying that your perception is, admitting this is hallucination in some way. But we must also avoid thinking of, this in terms of removing a veil and like discovering truth, as if what we were perceiving before was mere illusion, right? There is simply more than one way to apprehend reality. Think of, I don't know, animals such as a bat or something. You wouldn't really say that they're living an illusion or that they're hallucinating only because they perceive the world differently than we do. So immersive reflection is this combination of being outside oneself and more engaged in the world that can lead patients out of depression. And now I'd like to, go into a little bit more detail of how this process works. So we can begin to think about psychedelics as ecodelics instead. I think this is useful to think about this immersive reflection. So psychedelic is a word that kind of technically means mind manifesting, and if we switch it to ecodelic, it would suddenly mean environment manifesting, right? Eco environment, and this would also make sense in terms of how they sensitize us to our set and setting. So this in turn implies a different view of the unconscious, right? Normally we think of it kind of vertically as something that's below our consciousness or hidden in its depths, inside our head. But I'd say that we have to think about the unconscious horizontally as something that's out there in the world, right? So as Merleau-Ponty would say, it is not at the bottom of ourselves, behind the back of our consciousness, but in front of us. So in this sense, the unconscious is not something that escapes us because it is sealed and inaccessible, but because it is ubiquitous and pervasive, right? It's too familiar for us to notice. And as that which shapes our experience without being visible itself, we can also say that the unconscious is actually this horizon that phenomenologists are talking about, right? It's this experiential structure which determines how the missing sides of things appear, how the voids in our perception are filled, and the assumptions and directions we take for granted in our familiar orientation. So by constituting our field of action, this kind of practical orientation we're in, the unconscious delineates a directional possibility space that determines where you can go, and perhaps more importantly, as we will see, where you will not go. So by altering your experience of this field and loosening its boundaries, Ecodylix allow us to come up against or even beyond these boundaries in a very real bodily way. And by this I mean that the exploration of this unconscious takes the form of bodily exploration of the environment, right? Not only by analogy, but kind of actually. This is reflected in the language that patients use to describe their experiences, which from an embodied perspective is not really metaphorical. So patients described reconnecting to their mind in terms of mental space, agility, of light clearing away the fog, of being able to move out after being stuck. And these are all expressions derived from our embodied experience of the world. Hence as well, the metaphor of psychedelic experience as a journey or as a trip, which takes you or leads you somewhere, perhaps in fact somewhere where you would otherwise not go. right? These places you try to avoid are kind of zones of taboo or prohibition that warp your lived space and into which you avoid crossing. And again, I don't mean this merely metaphorically. You might, for example, avoid going to see an informative yet alarming documentary on climate change, or you might avoid going to a bar that reminds you of your ex because you want to avoid going to the emotional and kind of thinking places that such encounters will take you to. So it's very literal. To avoid these charged domains, however, to avoid them doesn't mean that they are any less part of your overall experience. Since they structure your field, they're always with you. They're kind of ghosts that haunt you wherever you go, right? They're precisely with you as to be avoided. So, how do we set and maintain a boundary that keeps them at bay, even as they remain all too close? I think here it'll be useful to look at the experiences of a particular patient in the Imperial College study, who just goes by the name patient 17 for, I guess, security reasons. So, what happened to this patient during the trial? He actually, during his psychedelic experience, he re-experienced the fear, confusion, and shock he felt as a kid when his grandparent passed away, and crucially, how his parents told him that boys don't cry. With this prohibition, his parents set down a boundary that would be in place until many years later. By blocking the body's impulse to cry, they were denying the kid's ability to express the mournful world which he then inhabited. So, in other words, they were not merely calming the inner state of the child, but turning off the resonance between body and world that is the principle of their open exchange. Through this intentional detunement, then, a certain detachment and dissociation between self and world was effected, putting in place a hard boundary, right? Which kind of amounts to a denial of your reality, as if it did not happen just because you stopped crying. So this established a restriction of responsiveness to situations to which crying might be an appropriate and now suppressed reaction. Situations whose effective value now appears as taboo, as something not to be dealt with but avoided. Every time such a situation would arise for him years later, this taboo would this taboo he carried with him since childhood exerted its pressure, making itself felt. He could not, let's say, take himself to the point of crying, to use this kind of embodied metaphor again. In general, the boy's capacity for resonance and response was severely limited. So, based on patients' own reports, researchers have noted that, in contrast to other forms of therapy, psychedelic therapy is valuable precisely because it enables you to face and accept difficult experiences rather than avoiding them, right? Which also goes against this kind of ideological notion of psychedelics as escapes from reality. If psychedelics are merely amplifiers of experience, however, should we not be afraid that they would only make things worse, right? For example, amplifying your depression, making you feel worse. How exactly are we to make sense that the idea of letting in rather than avoiding a painful situation would actually help to improve it, right? Why would we deal with painful situations at all? It's just better to ignore them. Okay, so what is, I think to think about these questions, we can think about presence, which is also kind of a notion that comes up a lot in psychedelics and other practices that surround them, like meditation, also Buddhist religious notions and yoga and so on. So what is being present, right? Um, what is Ecodylix, as I've been saying, like, they kind of amplify your environment, right? So they amplify your engagement with the world around you, and this is expressed by presence. While on psychedelics, perception usually becomes more vivid, colors have richer hues, things might change size and shape or appear to be moving, patterns and figures might emerge from unexpected backgrounds, and so on. So this heightened sensory engagement, as users often say, reveals that there is more to perception than we normally take notice of. In terms of the structure of motivation I discussed before, right, this kind of call and response between self and the world, we can say that the world suddenly offers a bounty of new solicitations, of new features and details which call out our attention and draw out our response. It is in terms of this increased responsiveness that we can think of the expansion of what researchers call the emotional repertoire. Again, this is not a purely internal amplifications, like as you can, kind of simply access different emotional states within you, but we should conceive it as an expression of an increased range of bodily resonance that is called forth by new worldly offerings, right? So precisely we can access new emotions because the world appears differently and we respond to it in ways that we weren't able to do before because it didn't appear as kind of inviting us to feel those ways. So in psychedelic therapy, patients are encouraged to surrender to the overwhelming generosity of psychedelic perception, right? This kind of, again, this notion of giving. It's the world that gives to you and you who responds. So you're told to face it and let it affect them, to let go of trying to control it or to, not turn away from it. So opening up to something different viscerally reveals that there is more to what is present than you could previously access. So to be present is not simply to confirm what seems straightforwardly in front of you, but to tap into the horizon, right? The other possibilities that reality offers. By bringing about this expansion in our range of response, Ecodylix forcibly suggests that reality is not exhausted by your previous perception, but that alternative possibilities exist therein. And again, we can return to patient 17 and see how this allowed him to transform his pain. Before therapy, right, he kind of inhabited a possibility space, which was determined, kind of shaped by his effort to avoid the memory of his granddad's death, and more generally, crying as a bodily response to later situations. So ironically, despite this effort to sustain this boundary, this avoidance had not served him to transcend his pain, but actually only served to carry it into the rest of his life, enveloping it as a whole. It is this very effort to avoid things that carries things with you. In a circular logic, the very effort to avoid pain made those situations appear as inherently painful and only painful, and thus as to be avoided. So this made it impossible for him to respond to such situations differently, right? To perceive that he could have, there was a possibility in the world to respond to them differently. And this restricted his capacity for response and shrank his experience of reality. In his own words, he said he had learned to put his feelings in a box, which again is an image that really neatly captures this idea of like hard boundaries of nothing passing from inside to outside, of being locked in and so on. And his psychedelic experience, by contrast, felt like opening a box that he did not even know was there. And this gave him a wider perspective that helped him appreciate the world is a big place and that there's a lot more going on than what was in his head. So by surrendering to psychedelic experience and immersing himself in the possibilities of the present, he was relieved of this boundary sustaining effort of separating himself from his pain, which is also to say from his world or his experience. And this freed up a lot of energy for him to interrogate and work through it instead of, simply remaining imprisoned in the past. So by letting in these painful parts of experience, which, because they had to be avoided, narrowed his boundaries of action, he was able to open onto a new field of possibilities which transformed his sense of reality. So you can either spend your energy holding up these limiting boundaries or surrender and let things in and spend your energy exploring what's beyond them. If you do not let things pass through you, you become stuck with them, while letting them flow into you and be expressed by your body enables you to get to the other side of them, right? Once they pass through, you arrive somewhere else. It's also like, the common notion of waves during psychedelic experiences also captures as well, where like you have a wave of a very intense experience that you just have to kind of sit through it and let yourself feel it, because if you try to turn away from it, it's only going to make it worse. So it is because psychedelic experiences open us to letting in or including excluded parts of our experience that they are transformative rather than only amplificatory. And this is why they also require integration, which is my last slide before we answer those key questions and come to a conclusion. So integration is opposed to dissociation and can only begin once we allow the flow between self and world to begin again, instead of spending all this effort in trying to close them off from each other. Because as the present suggests, this closure can become severely distressing, right? Shrinking your life. And opposed to this sensation of being trapped, psychedelic therapy offers a more holistic approach that does justice to our status as ecological subjects, who are embedded in, open to, and constituted by a multiplicity of relations to our environment. be it people or places or histories or nature, whatever it might be. Integration then is not, again, not an internal process, but an extension of our body beyond the boundaries of our skin. From this perspective, healing, in turn, is not to press ourselves into a narrow orientation and simply function, uh, if this narrow orientation actually breaks and disavows these relations, but to include, acknowledge, and mend them. So we can say that integration consists of an embodied reorientation of our sense of reality, and thus our sense of possibility, through an expansion of self and world to include the parts of our experience we were dissociated from. And it is this reorientation that explains the lasting effects of psychedelics, right? Beyond the high or the trip. Because what goes up comes down elsewhere and somehow altered. So after the psychoactive duration, we actually are inhabiting a different reality. So I'd repeat that again. This takes us beyond a reductive materialism that considers it all to be an effect of the brain on drugs, and it's actually the experience that they induce which transforms us. And it's also, again, this doesn't mean we should think of it as somehow spiritual or immaterial, right? As a suspension of our cultural self, but as a different engagement with the world. So no amount of psychological integration will do if patients cannot integrate their experiences into their everyday orientation towards the world. So I would suggest that it's actually more important to think about ego constitution than ego dissolution, to keep this in mind, right? So how is your sense of self constituted in this world, which you never leave behind, rather than how do you transcend it and leave it behind? How is your sense of self constituted by the multiplicity of real, historical, economic, cultural, biographical, and material forces and relations which pass through you? So with this, we can, finally kind of recap and come to a close by answering the key questions that I mentioned at the beginning, which are, what is the mechanism of action of psychedelic therapy? And the answer would be, it's an expansion and transformation of our sense of reality through a process of immersive reflection. Why can they be said to concern reality and not only the self? Because psychedelic altered experience is not an individual and inner phenomenon, but a worldly one. It concerns the world we're embedded in and an actually possible different perception of it. Why does it transform reality and not only amplify it? Because it helps us respond to and therefore include parts of our experience that we previously denied, avoided, or that were simply inaccessible, rather than just confirming us in what we already felt before we took them. And finally, why do psychedelics have lasting effects beyond their psychoactive duration? Because it is our horizon and field of experience, right, our sense of reality, that is expanded, and this makes new things and feelings possible in our everyday life, even as their chemical effects fade away. And I think with this, since I've been talking for a while, I'll consider it closed. And if anybody wants to ask me about this, the political embedding of my research, I'm happy to answer. But for those of you just interested in the therapeutic aspects, this basically sums it up. So thanks a lot for listening, and excited to hear your responses.
All right, thank you very much, Mateo, for the presentation. I think it was very interesting, and so let's start with the questions. If anyone has some questions, you can either just ask it or raise your hand, do the hand raise thing, or just ask the question. Please go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to ask something. But
yes, I think I would like to start. Like, first of all, Mateo, thank you so much. I think it's really impressive work. I remember still from the Insight conference in 2019 that you had a poster presentation. It was only text, but for me, there was already I would give it also a poster prize. So that already started like a thought process in me as well, and a whole reorientation within myself, within neuroscience, and this whole reductionistic kind of point of view on the individual and extending that beyond with more interest in social neuroscience. Mm-hmm. And I think, a bit more initially a bit disconnected from psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. I think generally this this framework kind of that you're setting up with this philosophy, I think is very interesting, from indeed also this individualism creating a sense of personal responsibility. So indeed that if you have an experience of indeed depressive thoughts, then that is sort of your fault for having these kind of thoughts, right? So I find that already disconnected from therapy such an important kind of point of view, that then you also further elaborate on with indeed certain the statements of like boys don't cry. And also I think my own personal experience in the last year with some depressive symptoms, and therefore also not being super connected with the psychedelic space, I think these values just are generally way more necessary, right? Also in just communication with friends, in this open communication, actually creating sort of the reality out there, and it's not as much self and others. So I think that's I think first of all, that's just a very interesting and very important point of view. I think with the Ecodelic, I do have some questions. I do see the value and the interest, and I guess there's a bit of maybe a binary discussion on that, in the sense of mind manifesting and environment manifesting. But there is still, and I don't want to change the conversation and lead to a bit more predictive processing, free energy principle, but there is indeed also with this re-engagement with the environment, I guess also still a certain mind manifesting on the environment, right? And I think I don't know, maybe you could elaborate a bit further on maybe there's also a bit of a disconnection, a connection actually between both factors being true at the same time and actually not being separate point of views.
100%. First of all, thanks for your comments on the importance of the perspective. That definitely means a lot to me. But to answer your question, I think also with this focus on reality transformation, I think it's the title of the presentation, and it's like the thing that I keep driving home and so on, mostly because of this kind of larger interest that I have on kind of forms of realism and politics, and partly because it's kind of the opposite of this kind of purely self perspective. But indeed, even from phenomenological perspective, it is precisely this kind of self-world relation that matters, right? So indeed, again, if we just return to the example of the kitchen, like there's no doubt that, I don't know, some sort of like, a bat doesn't perceive a kitchen as a kitchen. So it depends on a sort of human being who actually understands what a kitchen is for it to be a kitchen. So definitely there's a part of it which is relational, and which specifically it matters like what type of body you have, right? So for example, also if you go into this kitchen, whether you're taller or smaller, you will perceive kind of the top shelf as more or less accessible, and like the goods that are on it will stand out for you more or less. So there's definitely all sorts of things to say about here, and I think this emphasis on the world mostly and reality mostly is to kind of reverse a certain tendency and like shift our way of thinking, and not because the more personal or self aspects don't matter, and indeed, like also just to keep in mind, because of these political interests, it's more about like, okay, how the world actually is not the same for all of us. Even if from a kind of natural science perspective you want to say, well, actually we can all agree on what the world is like, right? That's kind of the assumption guiding scientific research. You kind of get to some sort of truth, hopefully, that you can kind of intersubjectively agree to. The truth is that it's kind of more complicated than that. And indeed, like our particular perspectives do matter a lot. And that matters, what matters there is like what our position in the world is, because the world is like so unevenly distributed. Right, so it's to keep this kind of perspective and kind of also social position aspect also in mind. But I would totally agree that, of course, you also have a sort of input on what the sense of reality is, and it matters. Like the fact that people change themselves, so to speak, matters in real terms. If somebody has, let's say again, like a political awakening, and that helps them become politically active and enact some changes in the world, like that obviously matters. It has, as a person, you are part of the real world. You're not some sort of independent thing. So indeed changes are always in both things.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. I think also now you indeed were very much on the level of the philosophical stream of phenomenology, but I also recognize a lot of points from a bit more like social constructivism. I
Yeah.
mean, that has its own issues as well with being, okay, then everything is self-explanatory by the reality you create by the act. But is there a source of inspiration in your work as well, in that kind of line of philosophy?
I mean, I'm also interested in the like philosophy of science and stuff. Definitely something I have to get a better grasp of. You know, especially from like sociological critiques of science or feminist critiques of science, and how like the aspect of perspective actually does matter. You know, like say, you know, psychedelics, you know, how they're often compared to like a microscope or a telescope. You know, it's like, well, microscopes and telescopes, they don't, it's not some sort of thing through which you kind of look through your biased eye and then suddenly you see reality as it is. It's actually an instrument that mediates your perception, right? I think a very like interesting example is of course like quantum theory, which, you know, just shows you that depending on how you ask the question to reality, it kind of answers one way or another with this, you know, like slits, I don't know, what double slit experiment, or what's it called exactly? So there's a lot of like very interesting work done in this kind of stuff. Um, but indeed, it's not a matter that it's, again, like, you know, social constructionism you were mentioning. It's not a matter of, you know, we're all creating this kind of shared illusion. You know, obviously the world out there also exists. You know, it's not only like minds connecting and making up the world, but objects and like other beings, animals, plants, whatever, they also respond, right? So you can actually get responses from the world itself. It's just that the way you ask the questions obviously determines how those responses appear. So I think I think it's just very difficult even for me to think about, even though I've been, you know, kind of working around these ideas for years, because the assumption that reality is just there as it is like so strong. Perhaps not only because of, you know, ideological reasons, but also just because of our everyday experience of the world, right? As I said, like as long as you don't really undergo like very significant shifts in your life and your experience of the world, you might not actually notice that it might not be the way you thought it was. So it's just a very strong force to think that things are just how they appear.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, also reducing a certain sense
All
of
right,
anxiety by
Ivar, sorry,
decreasing.
Ivar,
Yeah,
Ivar,
no,
I'm gonna cut you off to see if anybody else has any other questions.
yeah, I
feel
wanted
like
to
this
indeed
is
open
it's
the
a
floor
very,
now
yeah,
as well.
sorry, yeah, very interesting conversation, but I feel like it could go on for a very long time because there's a lot of, so you can continue, but let's see if there's any other questions first, if you don't mind. Otherwise, you can ask more. But does anybody else have any questions for Mateo?
I might have a question if nobody else has one. Hey, nice to see you. Really nice to hear about the research. So you mentioned a couple of times the term possibility and the space of possibility, which changes when you ingest psychedelics, I guess. What did you exactly mean by that? And yeah, does it come from some kind of philosophy as well?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, you know, the crucial element here is indeed because, again, like there's definitely many senses in which this kind of analysis of psychedelic therapy is kind of informed by my larger political and like social concerns, right? So in critical theory and like other, you know, critical theories of society, you basically have this idea of negativity. That's what they normally called it, right? Which kind of stands for the negation of what actually exists, right? So they're trying to like point to this dimension of reality that's, you know, actually beyond currently existing things, right? That actually has some sort of reality. And in terms of you know, phenomenology and so on, perhaps, you know, I kind of blasted over it. I took away this whole part about how perception works and how a sense of possibility is built into it. But basically, you know, because of there's a kind of sense of expectation built into your experience of reality, right? So say like classic examples would be like, you know, you're perceiving your cup, and because you're perceiving it from a certain perspective, you can only see kind of the front of it and not the back and so on, right? but nonetheless you perceive it as a whole object. And so how is it that even though you're missing aspects of it, you nonetheless perceive it as a unified thing? Well, this is because your perception actually includes kind of a sense of possible further perception, right? So you're always perceiving more than what's actually in front of you, right? Hence this sense of possibility as constitutive of your sense of reality. And of course, like, a cup is not very important, but, if you think about it in larger terms, like practical terms, it's like, okay, again, let's say like when you're like really, your reality is like, I'm a writer, for example, you're really considering that certain things are possible. And if they suddenly tell you that you can actually, you don't have to be a writer and you can do this whole other thing, or that, like this whole kind of idea of, stepping outside the box or thinking outside the box or whatever, it's kind of hits you hard because it wasn't included in your sense of reality as a possibility, right? So the question, of course, the more interesting question is how to exactly like translate that from kind of your experience of reality to kind of being a part of reality itself, right? So it's one thing that your experience includes possibility, and another thing to say that the kind of material world itself is not kind of fixed and determined, right? And here, like again, we'd go like to when you've read Karen Barad and stuff. So there's like this whole element as well of things not really being definitely how they are, like how like complexity theory and so on is thinking about material relations and causation not as a linear thing where it's like this thing causes that, but is like so entangled and complex that actually unpredictable outcomes are possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I don't know your M. You signed in as M, so I don't know your name, but
yeah, I'm
yes,
sorry. I don't know what's wrong with my settings, but I'm on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Do we have anyone else wants to ask something?
Yeah, maybe I can attempt to ask a question. I've been trying to formulate it, but I find it difficult to find the words. So I'm going to try, and if it goes wrong, then just discard the question. You just like discussed like the present moment being filled with possibility, or that element of possibility being there. And I was wondering, because I had some experiences where things were not one thing, things were multiple things at the same time. Yeah. And now looking back at that with like this default mode network turned on again and everything in its usual way of being, I noticed that my mind wants to steer away from it being multiple things at the same time. Mm-hmm. It wants to reduce that dissonance in a way. Sure. And that causes so much tension and so much I don't know how to say, but a lot of tension and friction. Mm-hmm. How can are humans designed in a way to deal with that amount of possibility in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know about kind of the, I guess what you would call in more scientific like terms, like kind of cognitive load of stuff, and whether that would destroy you. Certainly, like you seem to need a certain level of order in your experience of the world, which means putting certain limits on how much you're perceiving. Of course, like in I mean, being constantly in psychedelic experience, which would obviously be like exhausting and harrowing in many ways. And of course, there's also, kind of pathologies of this kind of, your mind is kind of cracked, as some people would say, and like, you're just perceiving too much. This would be like a kind of phenomenological take on schizophrenia and stuff, where you can't order your lived space enough for you to actually function, right? So there's definitely, kind of spectrum in which you want to be between too ordered, right? Which is, I mean, in the terms you were mentioning, this kind of default mode network against whatever the alternative is called, if there is any. Like if you're too order is something, you might fall into a more kind of depressive situation. And if you're too chaotic, then you might fall into a more kind of schizophrenic situation. And then there's, more people, more in the middle, and like you can have situations where, because you're like so strictly oriented from one perspective, say, like your job, like you need to, produce, and like, of course, work ethic, like you're very stressed, and like things must have this meaning, and you can only see them from this perspective. That can also, produce what you say, this friction or pressure that, can produce burnout and so on. And I think what, meditation or psychedelics, this kind of idea of presence does, is that it stops this kind of orientation that you had. It's kind of narrow and puts a lot of pressure on like your perception of possibilities, because to be able to function in the way that you want to, you need to discard all those things. And when you're present, you kind of just stop that. And when you stop being oriented in through like one particular perspective only, you suddenly like become a little bit more open to what's actually in front of you, and like different, possibilities for behavior and feeling actually become available. So that's how I would think about this. But there's certainly some limits in either direction.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ming. I think that was a great question. So it's definitely good that you asked. And I'm going to ask one now. Just going on this thought that that Ming and Mateo were just sharing. You talked a lot about the multiplicity kind of aspect of potential, but then there's also but then you were, now you were getting into the idea of the present moment, or and there's also a large part of what people, psychedelic experience is a sense of oneness. So
Sure.
there's this both ends. So that's one thing that maybe you could say something more about.
Yeah.
And the other thing was that I wanted to defend a little bit more the concept of the non-specific amplifier, which is obviously a simple. First of all, it's from Grof, Stanislav Grof definition. It is obviously a simplification of what psychedelics are, but I do think that it has some merit in the sense that for example, in this presentation, you've looked at psychedelics through the context of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, right, which provides a very specific context to the experience, and so I think what the definition of non-specific amplifiers is just trying to remark is that this transformation that is possible is not a necessary feature of that is obtained by taking up psychedelics. So it comes with some other whereas there can be other and in a way, if you take seriously also your perspective that the sense of connectedness is normal, is in a way more deeper, let's say, than the disconnectedness, and the fact that they are if they are amplifier of reality, that is not in contradiction with that.
Absolutely.
So there's two.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a kind of antagonistic response, because I completely agree. Like maybe I wasn't also clear enough in my phrasing. Like I wanted to think about how specifically the transformative aspects work, right? Which is about this kind of inclusion of excluded parts. But indeed, the amplification is very much real, and I do think that like it's a really useful concept actually. And I think like partly, I mean, my thesis, if we do the presentation on the political aspects as well, is very much based on that idea. It's like, okay, we can't assume certain outcomes from psychedelic experience, therefore we need to kind of give them a proper or a useful discourse and practice depending on what results you want to get. But I think also to some extent, there's a lot of conversations about what kind of therapy is the best for psychedelic experiences, right? And partly, there's a kind of descriptive side to that, which is, okay, what better explains what people report, right? Which is like part of what I'm doing. And certainly, like, I don't know, the work done with acceptance and commitment therapy and so on, like it kind of seems suited to what the psychedelic experiences are, sorry. But there's also an element of, it's not only how does it describe it, but how does it affect it, right? So actually, it's very important that you go into this therapy with this kind of contextual approach to actually kind of maximize those effects, draw them out more than if, say somebody goes into therapy, says like, I'm experiencing connection, and then somebody tells them, well, actually that's just in your head, like that might actually antagonize people and not actually draw out those consequences properly. So no, I think I do find the amplification, non-specific amplifiers super useful, even if, you know, just understanding the transformative effects like takes like an extra step, and might indeed only happen in certain contexts, right? Because there's also a lot of conversation about how it just kind of also amplifies these kind of conspiracies and like spiritual beliefs that are very ungrounded, and that's something I would definitely also want to be kind of careful about, you know, that these people can just say, oh, I've been transformed to such an extent, and now I know the truth, right? Then hence also the kind of moving away from this truth discourse around them.
Thank you, Mateo. Do we have any, what times? It's like 8:20. Do you have any more? Do we have any more questions? Someone that hasn't, anyone that hasn't asked one yet? Wants to ask a question? Who hasn't asked one? There's Josie. There's a cat behind Josie. They can see there's Zozia. Is that your name? Teresa, Molly, Maisie, Noel, Sam, and Marc Antonio. If you guys have any questions.
A little cat.
Yeah. Does the cat have any questions, Josie?
I don't yeah, I don't have any question. I mean, I just found this talk extremely interesting, and I'm going to think about it for quite a while. So I'm just very grateful that you were here tonight. That's basically the gist of what I'm experiencing right now. Maybe I'll have questions later on, and maybe I can contact you later.
Please do, absolutely.
Great.
Ivar, do you have any did you have any additional questions?
It's your moment, Ivar.
Well, no, not specifically. I mean, I was anyways rounding it off, but a final comment, and I recognized I wanted to open the space because I didn't want to occupy it all. But maybe a minor comment with this paper indeed on like moving from avoidance to acceptance and disconnection to connection. One thing I always see overlooked is that also there's a lot of description on indeed failed therapies beforehand, also amplifying this effect. So it has like there's two sides of it that I find very interesting, which of course, therefore, I also do like the approach of indeed using the framework of psychedelic therapy, of course, because the need for like a first hand initial treatment response is like also very important for that reconnection, let's say, that we also start seeing now with the comparison with citalopram, for example, right? So yeah, that's just a bit of a minor comment.
Yeah, it's I find it interesting about that paper that they're mentioning in the introduction, like, you know, kind of theoretical underpinnings, whatever, and they say, well, we found that the most useful type of therapy is in line with the values of humanistic psychology, which are like compassion, positive regard, and something like that. And I'm just, what the fuck have we been doing the rest of the time? Like everybody else they've come into contact before, people have been like spent years in depression, complaining of, you know, not being able to, you know, not being understood by others, and they're not being treated like that. Like that doesn't make all that much sense to me. Like it's kind of, you know, it's good that psychedelic therapy is bringing some of this stuff out, but it's also very sad to think that those were not the values that were guiding our approach to therapy in the first place. But yeah, if there's no more questions, I guess this does it.
Yeah, I think that's a good time to close. So thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Mateo, for giving the talk. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thanks to you guys.